Mish Hancock, and you are listening to MichMash, a place where I get to talk to the weird, wacky, wonderful people of this world, people I adore and want to know more about. Today, my guest is Richard Rosenfeld. He is an emeritus professor of criminology at the University of Missouri St. Louis. His research interests include the social sources of violent crime, crime statistics, and crime control policy. His current research focuses on explaining U.S. crime trends. Hello, Rick. Thank you for being on today.
Hello, Mitch. Thanks for inviting me.
So, the reason why I invited you is I kept seeing quotes from you showing up in all. There goes my dog. Sorry, Paul, you have to cut that out. Tubby, stop. Oh, I think my daughter's coming home. I'm sorry. Live on Facebook. Woo! All right. My daughter will get him to calm down. Let's start again. So the reason I reached out to you was because, I was seeing your name show up in all these different magazine and articles on the web and what have you about how what happens in your downtown when it comes to crime is going to start branching out to other places. And I live downtown St. Louis. And since I moved here, it's been kind of wild west. So I was really interested to talk to you to see about what is going on out there these days.
Uh, well, what's going on? What's going on in St. Louis right now is also going on in many other cities across the country. Really pinpointing the beginning is not all that difficult. Beginning at the end of May and through June and indeed through the summer, a number of cities, including St. Louis, have seen pretty significant increases in violent crime rates. And so St. Louis is in the company of lots and lots of places across the country. The increase in violent crime in most of the places really began in the last week of May. And that was the week that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And immediately thereafter, protests began and became quite widespread across the country. As your viewers know, protest activity was widespread in the St. Louis area. And so that has led to speculation about the connection between the protests against police violence and police misconduct and violent crime. Speculation is the right word for that connection. I don't think anyone knows for sure just how the protest activity has come to influence violent crime rates. One thing we do know, however, is that the violent crime is not due to the protesters themselves. There was some violence in the initial protests back in June, and it persisted to some degree in a few places, Portland, Oregon. But by and large, the spike in violence we've seen is a spike in the community, in the city. And that's been the case in St. Louis. I'll just, one concluding note on that is that we're not seeing violence spread into communities within cities, and this would include our own city of St. Louis, where violence has traditionally been very, very low. What we're seeing is that violence is on the uptick in those communities in cities, including St. Louis, that have traditionally had high levels of violence. And those tend to be disadvantaged communities of color.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, and so living downtown, I mean, and it was a last Saturday night. I was like, what is going on? There were sirens all night long, helicopters with their spotlights out. Um, my daughter had actually, she called 911 because there was a gentleman slumped over in his car, that she saw, and had called 911 about that. And she said she had to wait 7 minutes for 911 to pick up, which surprised me. in my head, I never thought you would be on hold with 911.
Yeah, that's certainly not good news. And I haven't heard other stories, though I suspect your daughter is not alone in people having to wait for an extended period of time just to make contact with 911. I suspect that's because of the first kind of observation you made, that on that Saturday evening, things were very, very active, lots of
Right.
people calling, and that generated delays. Was your daughter finally able to make contact?
She was, and what happened was she had been waiting with she was at a stoplight and the gentleman was not proceeding forward, and she thought maybe he was preoccupied on his phone or something. And
Hmm.
so she waited, and then she said the next stoplight came up, and she went,
Hmm.
and he just sat there at a green light, and she was like, okay. And so she went to go around him and looked and noticed he was slumped over, and then called 911. Now, luckily, the 911 operator had actually said, now, did you get out and check on him? And she went, like, did you want me to? And she went, no, 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 I didn't want you to. You did the right thing.
Right,
Where was it? We'll send somebody out there. But it just surprised me. I was really taken aback by her being on hold for that long.
right. Well, so for you and your neighbors downtown, uh, I have a suggestion. It's not a remedy, but um, uh, Captain Renee Kreisman is the captain of District 4, which is the
Okay.
downtown police district. And I know Renee. She's a good person and a responsive police officer. And contact her and let her know that in your experience, crime or crime related problems like the one your daughter encountered seem to be on the increase. Are they, in fact, according to Renee's information? What types of crimes are increasing? And how have the police changed their response to check the crime increase? I think she needs to hear that. So I'm not familiar with who your older person is, but I suspect this won't be the first call your alderman has received about crime downtown.
Right. And do you have any suggestions? Like, I'm on something called Lookout St. Louis,
Mhm.
which like lets you know when a crime has been committed in
Right.
your area, or but it doesn't give me a lot of, I mean, it just still say suspicious person.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, I'm like, why were they suspicious? What were they doing?
Well,
Do you have an identity? Is there something that I can, like,
yeah.
just suspicious person is not going to be very helpful.
That, believe it or not, is more or less official crime classification. Often the police don't know much more than suspicious person. They'll receive a report of a
Okay.
suspicious person. Now, that person may be suspicious only because people in the neighborhood never saw that person before in the neighborhood, but he or she is a fully innocent, person just passing through. Or it could be someone who's suspicious because they're up to no good.
Right. Right.
Um, and often the police, at least at the point they receive the call, don't know. And there are a whole batch of calls then that get converted to these suspicious person reports that in turn uh, fall in, become known to the service that you receive. I'm guessing that service relies on the mapping capabilities that the St. Louis City Police Department has, and anyone can go up on the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department's website, go to crime statistics, and there is a facility there that allows you to pinpoint an area such as your own, or pinpoint an address such as your address. And it will then provide for you within the last, I think it certainly the last 24 hours, going back weeks to perhaps a period of months, the number and types of crimes that have occurred within, you can specify the distance from your address, make it,
Interesting.
half a mile or a quarter mile, however you want to do that. So what you're doing is really probably using the facility that the service you already receive uses. It's just doing it for you. But you could look at other addresses as well, address of family and friends and so on.
Interesting.
It can be cold comfort in a way, because you'll see your screen populate very quickly. But each type of offense is color coded. And one more or less comforting note will be the large majority of incidents are relatively minor, though not necessarily minor to the individuals who might be involved.
Right.
But you're not going to see many shootings, other serious assaults or homicides, but you will see some.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. On Mondays, it seems like I find out, like, here's what happened over in St. Louis in the weekend. I'm like, oh my goodness gracious. Now, of course, the areas, the streets they're talking about, I don't really see Washington Avenue so much.
Right.
But it is so distressing, and it's so sad. It's, I mean, do you have any answers, any thoughts, any ideas on, here are some things that would make this better?
Well, staying in relatively frequent communication with the police department through Captain Creasman, and also through your city alderman is a good idea. Like everyone else, the police respond to pressure. And in this case, we're talking about very constructive pressure. And the more they hear from citizens about particular problems who live in particular areas, the more likely they are to respond. I don't know whether your community, whether that downtown community has something like a neighborhood watch program. But if it does, become more familiar with its activities. Needless to say, I hope needless to say, St. Louis is a city. You live in an area of the city that is actually quite active. And,
Right.
when you
Yes.
think
And
of some,
dense. There's a lot of people here.
yes, and that's a good thing. Businesses, beginning in the 90s and through the present, uh, allowing for the COVID slowdown, businesses have thrived along Washington Avenue and Locust and related areas. And that's a good thing. That brings lots of people to the area, however. A
Right.
lot of the clubs bring lots of young people in the area. And young people can engage in mischief. Let's hope mainly it's just mischief. But, where crowds gather, people who are up to more than just mischief also are attracted because there are targets of opportunity there. Young people or others who are staggering down the street after the bars close
Right.
become targets for street robbers.
Right.
And so one has to be careful at night, like in any big city. Be very careful at night. Don't stagger when you're out on the streets. If you can, walk in the company of others. But those are the kind of safety tips that should be very familiar to your viewers. That plus staying in touch with the police and making contact with community organizations like Neighborhood Watch, that may not be the name of the organization in your community. Coming to know the private security who operate in your community is also
Okay.
important. And when you see a private security officer on the street sitting in his or her car, go up, introduce yourself, ask how often they're there, where they are, when, become familiar. And the same would go for the public police.
So sorry.
No problem.
Like, we never have him barking, and he's just going to go crazy today. Okay, continue.
The same principle would apply to the public police officers when they're on duty in your area. Come to know them. Now, personnel will switch, but it's not difficult to come to know the officers. And as they come to know you, they're more willing to share information.
Okay.
And, you know, there's no secret sauce here. There's no magic solution. But those
Right.
are the kinds of things to do to, if nothing else, keep your own sanity about what's happening in your community. Stay in
Yes.
touch with people who pay attention to those things.
And be really aware and do not leave anything in your car. that,
Quite
that is a
obviously,
big one in St. Louis that,
right.
your car is going to get broken into if you're parked overnight and you have things out in your car.
Do not
Yeah,
do
just
that.
remember that. It's amazing. I think people just don't, because you hear
Right.
about people like somebody broke into my car and they got and I'm thinking, well, was it out where everybody could see it? Don't
Right.
show it,
Anybody who lives in a big city, these are tips not just for St. Louisans who have to live
Exactly.
downtown. Anybody who lives in a big city, and in particular in an area that's as active as yours, should know these tips by heart. They should be part of your urban central nervous system.
Exactly. Oh, I like that. I like that urban central nervous system. Okay, I'm working mine. So, one of the things I read about that I also wanted to ask about was what is called the Ferguson effect.
Yeah. Okay. Well, 5 years ago, after Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, widespread protests occurred, not just in our area, but across the country, not unlike what's happened during the past summer after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And so what we saw 5 years ago, as we've seen this summer, is that violent crime rates in particular, spiked after the Michael Brown killing, but also after comparable incidents in Milwaukee, in Chicago, in Baltimore, and elsewhere. Not all of which involved killings by the police, but involved controversial use of force incidents. So we saw a violent crime spike then. And the term Ferguson effect was first coined by our then police chief, Sam Dotson. And what he referred to by the Ferguson effect was a kind of twofold. On the one hand, police were being redeployed from their normal patrol assignments to deal with protest demonstrations. And that left many communities in the city under police compared to the policing they would have received prior to the protests. And in the chief's mind, that contributed to a spike in crime. But it also then changed community dynamics to some degree. He suggested that people in the community, but in particular people in certain communities who were up to no good, became emboldened as a result of the protests, either because they thought people in their area were so angry with the police that they weren't going to call them, right? And so that was an incentive to commit crime, or because they too noticed reduced police presence. And so it was sort of a combination of police and community response to the protests that, in Dotson's words, led to a crime increase. Now, then the term went national, and it was used by commentators of all kinds to refer specifically to this idea that the police were, in a sense, willfully or voluntarily withdrawing from full engagement in their activities because of concern given the protests of police misconduct, concern about increased legal liability, concern that their identities or their families' identities might be spread all over social media, anger, frustration. So they were willfully pulling back. And that's really how the term was used at the time. And indeed, we now hear, and I think we're going to hear more of, something called the Minneapolis effect, which draws directly on the Ferguson effect notion of 5 years ago, and suggests, just as that one had, that the police, because of anger, frustration, concerns about legal liability, were drawing back and not engaged in the kind of proactive activities that can help keep crime in check. So that's basically what the term meant. And I think we're not finished with it. It's coming back under a new label.
So is that really what happens? They are willingly pulling back?
Uh, there are anecdotes suggesting that some officers in some places are, but all we have right now are anecdotes.
Gotcha.
Now, they can't be ignored. But what we don't know is the scale of that sort of willful, whatever one wants to call it, dereliction of duty, willful but somewhat discretionary drawing back. I'm not going to pay attention to the minor stuff, but I will respond to the more serious stuff. We don't know the scale of that. But here's what we do know. Police departments have been hit by the COVID pandemic like every other aspect of our community. And what that has meant is that it's resulted in reduced police presence and police activity. Officers out on quarantine because they have the virus, or because they've been in contact with someone, often a colleague who has the virus. And of those officers who remain on duty, they're subject to social distancing policies and requirements by the department, or out of their own discretion, maintain social distance. That means reduce contact, and that means reduced activity of the sort that I was just describing that can help keep crime in check. Now, we do know the scale of that. That's measured by the St. Louis City Police Department. They measure what are called self-initiated activities, and they remain down considerably, even now, into into the month of October, compared with last October at this time. And earlier on in the summer, early summer and late spring, they were way down when we were at the height of business closings and the beginning of the response to the pandemic. So we do know that there's been reduced police presence and activity owing to COVID.
Gotcha.
What we don't know, can't put a kind of comparable number on, is the degree to which police activity has been reduced, if you will, voluntarily because of officer frustration, anger, concern about legal liability or related reasons.
So is that part of your research now?
The response of the police, not per se. My recent research activity has resulted in a couple of studies I conducted for the Council on Criminal Justice, which is a national crime and justice reform organization, looking at crime changes in big cities across the country, including St. Louis. We went back to the beginning of, we went back several years, the beginning of 2017, and in our most recent study, ended at the end of August 2020, this year. We looked at crime rate changes during that period compared with the past. And what we found was that increase in violent crime that I was describing, and in nearly all of the cities, beginning in the last week of May, and that was the week George Floyd was killed. We also found, however, a very sustained drop in property crime. We're seeing the same thing in St. Louis. That began with the business closings and quarantines at the beginning of the pandemic. The biggest category of property crime is larceny. Larceny are thefts unaccompanied by force, so they're not robberies, They don't involve breaking and entering, so they're not burglaries. They consist of shoplifting, for example. And when the shops were closed, there was no shoplifting.
Right, right.
Residential burglary, though, also went down. People were at home because of quarantining, because they're where they worked, those places were closed. And burglars tend to avoid occupied households. So residential burglary rates went down. So it's a two-phase story. The attention, I think appropriately so, has been devoted to the increase in violence. Violence is a more
Right.
serious type of crime. But nobody wants to have their home burglarized
No.
or their shops lifted, if you will, or their purse stolen off the table if you're sitting outdoors at a cafe. That's a larceny as well.
Yep.
So it's all important, but there's no question we want to make sure to focus on the uptick in violence, recalling that we're all a little bit less likely to be victimized by property crime.
Right.
Thanks,
So
interestingly enough, to COVID.
that is interesting. No, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess I just never thought about it, but it completely makes sense. So I have this other question for you that I thought was really interesting about um, the whole idea of can we cure violence? And you talked about
Yeah,
focused deterrence.
right. Okay, well, cure violence is actually a term that is used to describe a particular type of intervention that's designed to reduce violent crime. Focused deterrence is a different type of intervention. Just looking at the clock, no problem. So let me talk about both types of intervention. Cure violence is a public health-based strategy that began in Chicago and now is spread to other places, including our own city of St. Louis. There are now 3, perhaps 4, but 3 spots in the city that the cure violence intervention has been implemented. And my understanding is it will be include a 4th. The city has literally devoted millions of dollars to this effort, scarce, needless to say, scarce public dollars to this effort. And what the effort involves is training people who live in a community, very familiar with the community, excuse me, to, if they're not already, doing so, monitoring violence, conflict situations in their community that could turn violent and or already violent situations that could invite retaliation.
Okay.
And then intervening in those disputes to prevent future violence. It's a strategy that appeals to many people because it doesn't directly involve the police.
All right.
And because it's community-based. It makes sense, but it's a tall order.
I was going to say the
Very
person that
tall order.
volunteers for
First
that
of
is.
all, you have to have people who are very, very well trained so
Mhm.
that they both know how to monitor, conflicts occur all the time, every day in communities of all sorts.
Right.
One has to be able to select among those conflicts, those most likely to lead to violence, or select among those violent conflicts, those most likely to lead to retaliation or other types of future violence. And then train to effectively intervene in disputes to prevent the future violence from occurring. Now, there's been some research on this effort in other places. I would say it's something of a mixed bag. There's some favorable results, some showing not much of an impact. We'll see what happens in St. Louis. That's something to keep an eye on, though. We've made a major commitment to that strategy.
Yeah.
And we're going to want to make sure if it's successful that we find out, and if it's not successful that we find out, so we can turn our attention to other strategies, one of which is the other one, focused deterrence.
Gotcha.
This one does involve the police and other criminal justice personnel, such as prosecutors and judges and juvenile justice officials, and probation and parole officials, and the U.S. attorney, and the list can go on. And it involves ministers, social service providers, and those who provide other support services. And it's focused in the following sense. People are called into meetings, and these are people who have, because of their prior arrest history or their prior victimization history, who are at very high risk for violence in a particular community,
Okay.
as offenders, as victims, as both. And they are called into meetings. This has been done, by the way, in St. Louis, and I, with a graduate student, evaluated it, and it turned out to be effective. And in any event, they're called into meetings, and a two-pronged message is delivered. The first message is kind of the stick message. We know who you are, clearly. Our eyes are on you, clearly. And if you become involved in another incident of violence, we're going to pull all available levers to take you off the street and not endanger your community any further. And then the carrot message is delivered, and they can be delivered in tandem, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And the carrot message is, look, if you want out of this life, here are services and supports. Here are family members. Lots of family members often attend these meetings. Here are neighbors. Sometimes other community members will attend. Here's the local pastor. They all want to help. So if you need to finish high school, if you need to deal with a drug problem, if you need employment training or employment, here are services and supports that can help. The choice is yours. You know, there's a big focus here on taking control of your situation.
Right.
And this research approach has received relatively consistent support in the research literature. And as I mentioned, we evaluated this kind of program in St. Louis. What we found, what we were able to do is randomly, we worked with probation and parole. They wanted to do the program. And we said, great. How many people do you want to have involved? And they said, well, way more than we have room for. Typically, the meetings are 25, 30 people, max.
Okay.
So we said, great. Send us a list and we'll randomly choose people to go to the meetings and people otherwise similar, the randomly chosen who don't. And we'll compare the results over time. We'll wait some months and see who's more likely to get arrested. And as it turns out, those who went to the meeting were less likely to get arrested than those who didn't.
I'll be
Now,
darned.
it's surprising, it seems, that a single meeting might have that effect. But recall that that single meeting meant that for many of the people there, once the meeting ended, they went over to the social support or services table, took information, and perhaps then followed up with the services. Now, that's one version. That's the dominant version of the approach. I'm a big fan of this approach, as you can probably tell.
Well, I think it sounds amazing. I mean, it's like you're
Yeah.
giving that person a support system.
Yes. Now, it can be done on a one-on-one basis too. I'm assuming some school teachers or people who have been to school certainly are viewing. So imagine the kids in school, and you might not have to imagine, maybe you were one of them who really needed extra attention. They were just falling through the cracks, either academically or behaviorally or both, right? And so there are two ways of dealing with that. One is to form a group and administer remedial education to the group. You know, two-pronged message. We know who you are, and if it's a behavioral problem, look, we can't put up with this much longer.
Right.
But here are services and supports that we think will help. Or it can be done individually, tailored to that individual's particular problems, desires, and needs. And arguably, the individual approach, though less efficient, you're not dealing with as many people at once, could be more effective on a one-on-one basis. So the St. Louis Police Department does have a program that does that with high-risk folks. They're on probation or parole. They're visited by police officers in their homes. And often they're a family member or more will be there. And once in the home, that two-pronged message is delivered, but now it's tailored to the individual's particular circumstances. So the officer finds out, this person has got a drug problem. Everything else has got to be put to the side until that's dealt with. This person did finish his GED. Oh, sorry.
Incoming message.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
You're fine. I get it.
This person finished his GED, but is having trouble getting a job. Let's see if we can use our contacts to provide some employment support and so forth. We're evaluating that program, again, through a randomized design where there are more people eligible that can be served by this program. And so some are randomly selected to participate, others are not. I should say, however, in full disclosure, that the number of we want a lot of cases, so we have something substantial to analyze. And COVID just did a number on the program because it's based on home visits. And it's picked back up a little bit, but we're well behind of the number of participants that we'd like to evaluate. So we'll see about that one. But you get a sense of what that approach is about. It's far less costly than the violence interrupter approach, the so-called cure violence approach. That doesn't mean it's necessarily any more effective. We'll see what happens with cure violence. I would hope that everyone viewing this podcast contacts the city of, contact your alderperson and say, give me the latest news you have on cure violence. Now, it's almost certain that that's been affected by COVID as well.
Right.
But we really, really want to know how effective that's been. It's overseen by the city health department. Contact the city health department directly.
Okay.
Find out. A lot of our tax dollars, and I speak as a city resident as you are, a lot of our tax dollars have been devoted to this effort. We really, really need to find out if it's working.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that information.
Sure.
So I know we don't have a lot more time, but I have like two fun questions. Can I ask you the two fun?
Sure.
I asked you my serious question. I was wondering if there are any fictional criminologists that you like or dislike.
Oh, Sherlock Holmes.
All right.
Oh, there's no question.
Your favorite?
Fictional criminologists other than Sherlock Holmes.
No, it can be Sherlock Holmes. You get to choose that.
Sherlock Holmes. Yeah.
I love it. And then growing up as a kid, did you have a favorite Saturday morning cartoon?
Yeah. Not so much cartoon. I was more, well, the Looney Tunes, yeah. And then a little later, Rocky and Bullwinkle. Although I don't think they were on Saturday mornings. They were on Sunday.
I think they were, or after school or something.
Yeah.
Right.
But I was into the serials that ran on Saturday mornings and also ran in the movie theaters in those days.
Okay.
So I was a huge Three Stooges fan. Actually, I'll have to admit I still am. Johnny Mac Brown was a serial. Hopalong Cassidy, The Lone Ranger. I was into that stuff.
Gotcha.
Actually, you might call them early kind of crime-related shows.
Right. Well, exactly. That's why I wanted to know. I was like, I mean, did it all start from, you had an interest that early and it's been your passion ever since?
Yeah. Although I never knew I would become a criminologist until much later in life. My PhD's in sociology, And up until the point I began thinking seriously about my dissertation, I wasn't all that interested in crime per se. I became interested, though, for a couple of reasons. One is that my mother, who at that point, she's since passed, she lived actually not very far from where I live right now in the Central West End. And she gotten held up on the street a couple of times. She
Oh
wasn't
gosh.
hurt, but it
Yeah, that'll
traumatized her. And
shake you.
I became interested in crime for that personal reason. I also, between the time I'd finished my exams but hadn't really even begun my dissertation, I was out of graduate school for a while, and I ended up getting a job teaching in a maximum security prison in upstate New York, where I was living. It was a college program. In those days, prisoners could use Pell Grants to fund college. And so almost literally, my first teaching experience was teaching in a maximum security prison.
Wow.
And that plus personal experience, plus academic interests as well, made me decide, no, this is what I want to study this phenomenon.
Wow. Well, I think you found the right path.
Hmm.
Well, Rick, thank you. This has been fabulous. I really appreciate your time today and sharing all of this with us.
Sure, Mitch.
All
Happy to do
right.
it. Okay.
Thank you, sir. And
See you
everyone who
again.
has been listening out there, you're listening to MichMash Podcast. Thank you and have a wonderful day.